Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. 2024 marks 80 years since the founding of the Liberal Party of Australia. The party is an enduring legacy of Robert Menzies and others. Today's episode of Afternoon Light forms part of a special 10-part series to commemorate this 80th anniversary. Each of the 10 episodes will feature an author from our upcoming book on the founding of the Liberal Party, Unity in Autonomy. The book will be available from Connor Court and the Robert Menzies Institute's website in October this year. The role of women in the formation of the Liberal Party of Australia is an essential element of that story. Without women, it isn't much of a stretch to say that there would be no Liberal Party. Joining me to discuss how women made a difference is historian Anne Henderson. Welcome to Afternoon Light again for a second run, Anne. It's lovely to have you on.
Hi there, Georgina.
Well, I'm glad you've come back for a second go. You write a lot, particularly about the stories of women, but not just women, of course. You've written that fabulous book on Menzies versus Evatt, this great rivalry of Australian politics, but also books on Enid Lyons. It was a great trailblazer for women in politics, and I think should get a lot more recognition than she probably does for the contribution she made. But tell me about women getting into politics and why it took so long for a woman to be elected to the federal parliament after they got the opportunity to in, 1901, I think, straight from Federation, wasn't it?
Federation was a remarkable event, and truly for women it was terrific because in the second election for that, women had the suffrage, so women were allowed to vote and presumably stand for parliament. But we came off a colonial base and the states didn't give women the right to stand for parliament individually till I think Victoria was the last, so it was 1934. South Australia had allowed it from when they gave the vote in the late 1890s. The other states went along, I think it was New South Wales in 1918, Western Australia in 1920 and so on. But the women who first got into politics got into the state legislatures and they were all of the conservative non-Labor side of politics. Edith Cowan in Western Australia, Millie Peacock in Victoria, and Millicent Stanley in New South Wales and Irene Longman in Queensland at various times when they were able to stand for the state legislatures. And they probably found it easy to stand for the state legislatures because it was a more locally based electorate. None of them lasted more than one term. So it was a kind of whatever. But to get into federal politics, two women got in at the same time, one Labor and one UAP, which was non-Labor, which was Enid Lyons. So Dorothy Tagney got into the Senate in 1943. Now, she had tried a number of times in Western Australia to get into federal politics, and she never made it. But in 1943, because there was such an enormous swing to the Labor Party and the voting in the Senate was a bit different, once you got a big swing, you got most of the seats in the Senate. She got in when nobody expected her to win a seat. Now, it was much the same with Enid Lyons, who put her hand up after two men had been chosen for the seat of Darwin. But because she was Dame Enid Lyons, they had to accept her, and nobody really expected her to win because it was most unusual for a woman. She did very well, though, even though there were 8 counts of preferences. She got a lot of votes at the end from the men who were overseas in the military. It was wartime. So she scraped in and she kept her seat until she chose to retire in 1951.
Amazing. So she was in for 18 years.
She was there from 43 to 51. So, yeah.
You said she was pre-selected because she was Dame Enid Lyons. But for those of our listeners who perhaps aren't as familiar as you are with Enid Lyons, why was Dame Enid Lyons of note? Why was she obviously going to be accepted and not these men?
Well, Dame Enid Lyons had married a man 18 years older than her in 1915. His name was Joseph Lyons. Now, he was then the Treasurer Education Minister in Tasmania for the Labor Party. It was an extraordinary marriage. They went to a Premier's conference for their honeymoon. But then
it is deep commitment, isn't it?
It was. And then he became leader of the Labor Party after the big split in Labor over conscription, so at the end of the First World War. He was opposition leader till the early 1920s when he became Premier. Tasmania has this preferential system a bit like the Senate, so it's always very close. So he fell into government when the other side broke down in the Parliament, and he became Premier and she became the Premier's wife. And during that period, She stood for the state of Denison, which was the Hobart seat, to try and draw votes off an independent woman for the Labor Party. She nearly won. She had 6 children, one of whom was a baby, who died actually about 3 months later. I can't remember what it was, meningitis or something. So she had this extraordinary domestic life, but she still could maintain a public presence. Now, the reason she was so good in the public presence was she'd been an amateur actor, but she had a very clever style of speaking. She could bring people with her emotionally, and she would talk of the big public issues and mix them in with little domestic metaphors and whatever. So Joe thought of her very much as an asset, who is most unusual. He didn't step back and think, this is the woman who needs to be at home and I am the man who's doing the work. He was a bit of what his granddaughter called a touchy-feely new age guy. So Enid got a lot of practice in politics. They used to go to Labor Party meetings and take different sides and whatever. But then he got into federal politics in the Scullin Labor's storming of landslide in 1929, became acting treasurer for a while, and in 1931 split from Labor because of the very big divisions there were over financial policy. He ended up joining up with the Nationalists and was elected without being in the meeting by the Nationalist Party to be the leader of a new party, the United Australia Party. So I don't think there's ever been a leader of a party elected while not in the room that elected.
So he didn't even nominate? Well,
he wasn't a nationalist. He was a Labor figure who'd left Labor.
Yeah.
And so he wasn't entitled to be at the Nationalist Party meeting. But John Latham agreed to step down because he was a very popular figure and he was able to draw votes. So he had a landslide win at the end of 31, and the two of them were kind of a team because whenever she had the opportunity to speak, he would encourage her to do so. And she became known as part of the Lyons team, and it was Depression years. And these two rather humble people that had this large family, they ended up with 12 children, and they obviously didn't have lots of money. They weren't poor, but they were certainly pushing it to look after 12 children because everything was paid for in those days, including medical expenses. She became a personality in her own right. Now, he was a very able politician. He brought a huge number of voters who'd never voted for the Conservative side of politics. In 1931, he brought them over to the Conservative side. And the two of them managed to develop a kind of homespun connection with ordinary people, which the Nationalist Party never had before. But he died in 39 suddenly, and she went back to Devonport as a widow. And then her daughter, in 43, she said, "Oh, Mum, you can't be around the house moping and moaning." And she said, Enid, one of her daughters, whose husband was away with the military, she pushed her to put a hand up. And, of course, there are already two men now. Tasmania has what they call a Hare-Clark system of voting for the state legislature, and that is like the Senate. There are multi-candidates for each electorate. So a lot of Tasmanians are used to more than one person standing for the same party. So they let Dame Enid Lyons stand, but Dame Enid Lyons, being the personality she was, grabbed or got the support from a number of people who'd worked for Joe, and they just ran the most amazing campaign. I mean, in the middle of a freezing, know anything about the west coast of Tasmania in winter, down in Queenstown and Strahan, in the middle of the snow and the freezing, it's full of miners, they're all Labor supporters. She goes down there and she holds meetings in hotels. There's a photograph of her standing on a station. She's all rugged up and there's two men standing beside her, and this is their chilly reception in Strahan and Queenstown. Anyway, she went on the radio whenever she could and whatever she did. And as I say, after 8 counts of preferences, she won the seat.
Yeah, incredible. I mean, was it remarked upon that it was unusual for a woman to be taking this position, or was she just sort of riding the wave of this partnership with her husband and their kind of, I guess, combined popularity?
I think it was unusual, but because they did it in the style they did it, because Joe would always praise her, would always say, "Let my wife talk. You'll really enjoy her." And he'd pull her up and make her go and say a few words at the end of his speech. They went to Western Australia during the secession campaigns in 1934, and she went too. And they were very rowdy meetings because the federal government was trying to stop Western Australia from seceding. One meeting was a meeting of women, and Joe Lyons was there with a senator, and the women just wouldn't listen. They told the men to shut up, and they called on Enid. And Enid, although she was not talking for the popular side of the debate, she turned it into a Q&A. She had this very fine speech. She forgot her notes. She left them. Someone sent them back to her afterwards. She just said, oh, tell me what your problem is. And someone would ask her a question and then she'd respond. I mean, that's ingenuity. She could feel her audience and she won them over. Not that they'd necessarily changed their votes, but she calmed a very riotous kind of audience and actually they listened. So she had a natural talent at the podium. And that shone through. She was also, you know, she wasn't the tall, thin thing. She was the plump, matronly figure, the mother of the nation kind of thing.
Yeah.
To some extent, her personality, because Jo died early, has drawn away attention from the things that the Lyons government did, because they all think it was the creation of Jo rather than the other way around.
Yeah, well, maybe they created each other.
Well, they did. Yes. They did. As you well know, a partnership does that.
Yes, yeah. So 1943, two women are elected for the first time to federal parliament, Dorothy Tanguy and Dame Enid Lyons. Was there something about that moment, that 1943, that led to this, or was it its time, or was it just because of the two, as you say, in the West Australian context, Dorothy Tanguy was literally elected in this like landslide of votes for Labor, and then Enid Lyons was just so high profile, how could you resist her? Was that it? I mean,
a bit of all of that. Firstly, you've got to remember it was wartime.
Yes.
So many men were not there to put their hands up. But in Enid Lyons' case, she put her hand up after two had already done so. But the other interesting thing is that they had to put their hand up. And what's interesting that by the 1940s, women had started to become part of the public sphere in ways that they hadn't been up to the First World War. There were lots of organisations. I say what trade unions did for mostly men, like bring them into the public sphere, women's organisations, women's leagues, women's societies. They started to get reported on the front page or the business pages of the media, not down in the women's society pages. So in other words, the woman's voice was starting to be listened to, which is the first step. So those women had a go, and that's the main thing. And you would know yourself in politics, having a go, you've got to put your hand up. You can't just wait for someone to come and ask you to dance.
No.
You've got to get in there.
Absolutely, yeah.
And both of them did that. And circumstances apart from that played into their hands for good.
Yeah. No, and as you say, it was very much that there were less men present in Australia, obviously off fighting the war. So this was a moment for women to fill those voids and take the opportunities if they were prepared to put their hands up. She stands, of course, for the United Australia Party, but it's in its sort of death throes by that stage, by 1943.
It did.
What was her political philosophy and how it fit within that UAP structure?
Well, Enid had always spoken up for women in public life, but she was also very strong on women with families. There is some suggestion that she was pushing the Liberal Party or the UAP, or whoever it was, I can't remember which year it was, before the 46 election, they'd be the Liberal Party, to do something about child endowment, because I think it only went for the first two children. I mean, she would always say, well, what about the rest and blah, blah. She was very strong on birthing mothers. She was very strong on women playing a role in public life. And she spoke in an earthy sort of way for the people that she knew. And in Darwin, when she did win the seat, she was fantastic. She could talk about anything from potatoes to the cost of travel between Tasmania and the mainland, to why women should be supporting the war effort. And she once, extraordinarily, decided she could make a whole meal, I think it was out of a shank of lamb or something, and she demonstrated how she could make the pastry out of the marrow of the bone, and she could do this and that. And I mean, she had that earthiness, but she could also project that into what people understood in their lives. And that was partly because she wasn't a rather toffy lady. She could sound very educated and whatever. But, I mean, even in her dotage in her retirement, she'd wallpaper part of the house. She was just a very unusual lady. Her daughter found her once trying to clean the guttering at the back of the house in her 70s. She was in the car and she nearly had an accident and drove back into the house to tell her to get off the roof. So she was a hands-on lady who could also play the role of a public figure.
I mean, we would say, I guess these days, very down to earth.
Yeah, very. Yeah. But she could you'd read her first speech in Parliament. She could turn that domestic metaphor into something very high-minded. I mean, she wasn't like the men sitting by the fireplace with her feet on the mantelpiece, and then she compared herself to the new broom in the broom cupboard. And then alongside that was quite serious suggestions for public policy.
Yeah. So it's interesting, people like, of course, Dame Enid Lyons, but those women's groups, societies, leagues, they tended to be on the right side of politics, not the left, not the Labor side. Do you have an understanding of why that was?
Well, it's interesting. One of the big factors in the Liberal Party creation was the Australian Women's National League. Now, that was formed to bring women into the idea that politics was also for them. But it was a very conservative organisation. It came out of people who were very well-to-do in Victoria, in Melbourne. I mean, it was begun in the magnificent home of Janet Lady Clark. Ivy Brooks was Deacon's daughter. They were the ladies of the conservative side of politics. Now, they had very close connections with the men who ran a lot of things. They ran businesses. They were often the government. So they were used to dealing with the men who were what you'd call the captains of industry. That's a lovely phrase. Yeah. And whatever. So in many ways, they had an advantage that the more Labor women were sort of more the oppressed pushing up. They were the ladies looking down on the whole issue. Now, they were very conservative, but they were also very big. I think in the First World War, they had something like 50,000 members. When they merged with the Liberal Party, they were down to 12,000 because the Country Women's League had taken a lot of their membership. But even 12,000 is a good number, especially in the 1940s, 44.
Yeah, amazing.
And they connected up with international leagues. And when the greatest of their presidents eventually made her way into the upper echelons, Elizabeth May Couchman had a university degree from Western Australia, and she was really switched on. She'd married Claude Couchman, who was a retired army officer. He had children from a former marriage, but she never had any of her own children. And he died in the 1930s. And she by then was connected with all the right groups. But she wasn't just connected, and she didn't come from that upper echelon. She was a pragmatic, switched-on woman of public life. She knew that there were certain areas where you could get heard and certain ways in which you could get heard. So she went overseas for trips to Geneva for the League of Nations and women's organisations in Paris and whatever. She was a lady who pushed her way into a world that had been seen mostly for men. But she was very switched on, although the AWNL did not agree with women being part of politics, even voting for a long while. But they gradually changed under her. She could see that the way forward for women was to get in there and be part of the swim. She never got a seat herself.
And why did the AWNL initially not want women to be in elected office? I mean, they were obviously interested in public policy issues affecting the nation and particularly, I guess, affecting families. But then to not see then the next step of our members could then be in Parliament representing the issues and views that we share and making change.
I say that if we look back to the world of between the First and Second World War and look at the attitudes to the roles of women, we can't believe what it was. It was literally almost for those that are polite society. Men were the public order. They looked after the public order, and women established themselves in the private order. And of course, in the wealthier homes, women ran huge domestic arrangements. So they had a view that getting into the public arena would kind of lower the quality of womanhood. It was almost as if they believed women had to stand for something that wasn't, I don't like to use the word dirty, but messed up by the grind and give and take of the grisly battling of politics.
Sure.
Women would be kind of beyond that. Of course, underneath in the labour areas, women wanted to get whatever they could, but they had the trade union movement against them because that was very masculine.
Yes.
So it took a while. And in the 1920s, it was Elizabeth May Couchman who actually finally pushed them to accept that women had a right to a role in politics. And then they became quite strong supporters of that. And they developed all kinds of ideas about how women could make a good contribution. And again, it was just the progress pushing them along. But when you get to the 1940s, they're ahead of the Labor side women because they've already established themselves in a position of influence and power. Because they have all these members, they have 20,000 or 15,000 or whatever members, the press take them seriously because they're people who have an allegiance to this public body of women, and their views are listened to. So,
and they're taken seriously by journalists, so their
yes,
views are reported on by the journalists.
And their meetings are advertised in the paper and they're reported back who spoke for the meeting. Now, okay, not a lot about the meeting, but they're regarded as an important influence in democratic politics. And that's how they become important to the founders of the Liberal Party.
There's a quote here that says the AWNL was the last word in conservatism and the butt of a lot of cartoonist jokes. But, I mean, this was an era where being called conservative in Australia wasn't exactly a badge of honour. Most politicians, political activists didn't want to be labelled with that moniker. The AWNL, would they have characterised themselves as conservative? Or?
Well, that's a quote from Dame Enid, because when they founded the UAP in 1931, some of the most prominent of what would become the ministry were people who came from the Labor Party. Well, there were 5 of them. And Joe Lyons, Jim Fenton. Jim Fenton was a completely typical Labor guy who had one of those inner Melbourne Labor seats. Enid went along to help him win the 1931 election because they've left Labor. So the problem is, will they hold their seats, some of them? And she faced the most terrifically wild and nasty meetings. People were throwing things at them from the floor. There was Enid with Jim. Now, Jim, he couldn't believe what he was going to have to mix with, these posh ladies. But the posh ladies looked at Jim and thought, oh, he's going to be one of the ministers of the government. Good heavens, we can't possibly associate with that. So there was quite a class divide there, but they came to support the UAP very strongly. And, of course, Enid Lyons got on with them famously because she was used to playing lady host. She'd been Premier's wife. Her honeymoon was at a Premier's conference. I mean, she had been mixing with leadership for so long. And Jim eventually got round to it. And, of course, they eventually got round to thinking it wasn't too bad. But they wouldn't join at that stage in 31. They would not join the UAP. Their independence was too important to them. And, of course, this is what happened in 1944 when something changed. And that.
Yes. So tell me about how the AWNL, under the leadership, of course, of Elizabeth May Couchman, how it came to be part of the founding of the Liberal Party. I mean, this is, as you say, from the 30s when it wanted to be independent of these male-dominated political parties to the 40s when it actually started to actively consider and then does become part of a political party. This is a big about turn.
It is. And May Couchman, and I think it might have been Ivy Brooks, but certainly there are about 3 or 4 of the women from the AWNL that were at the meetings in Albury and Canberra in 44 that made the decision to change the name and create a new party. The women who went from the AWNL to those meetings were in agreement with the idea that the AWNL should merge and become part of the bigger Liberal Party of Australia, not just support them at elections. But they had to go back to the AWNL. It was mainly Victorian, and convince the members that they should give up their independence and whatever monies they had and supporters they had all become part of the Liberal Party. So in January and February, Elizabeth May Couchman and Ivy Brooks and those others, they supported her at meetings of the AWNL. But there was an opposition group that did not want to change. And it wasn't until, I'm not sure what date it was, July or something, that they had a meeting of 600 members that voted for the AWNL to join the Liberal Party. So it was really May Couchman. She was always called May. That's why I kept putting Elizabeth May. Until history came along, she was always known as May. Elizabeth May Couchman rode that campaign with the help of a couple that were with her at the Liberal Party conventions and won the day. And it was quite outstanding that happened. I mean, she had to persuade, the other members with her had to persuade this group that what they'd taken as their own special fiefdom and just surrender it to a male-dominated political party. But it changed. It took a long time, but it gave women a way in to the world that was male and would continue to be male, well, right up until almost now, but a way into the world which was real politics. It wasn't just outside influence. It wasn't just helping the candidates at election time when the AWNL was amazing during elections. They would do all the sort of handing out advertising, running around, being at polling booths on election day, all of that stuff. They were terrific behind the scenes. But this now allowed women to have a say. And also, as you know, the Victorian Liberal Party passed a motion that all their subsidiary groups or whatever would be equally male and female. So that's still an organisational thing, but it gives women a chance to learn politics and maybe move into the real thing. Now, in 1949, another woman was elected into the Senate. We got an Annabel Rankin, and then we gradually always into the Senate. A few more trickled in here, there, and there. And then when Margaret Guilfoyle got her seat in the 70s, the seat that she got was regarded as the woman's seat. So it's like a glacier moving. It's slow. I still wonder if there isn't a need, like in the Labor Party, for a really strong, as there was before the 96 election, a much stronger movement to push women into seats that are winnable. We've had that discussion and we'll continue to have that discussion. But all of that is the ongoing progress of women in politics. It starts, though, with the formation of the Liberal Party, when women get a right to have, in Victoria, equal numbers in the various Liberal Party organisational groups. And Enid Lyons wasn't at Albury. She didn't get on with Robert Menzies at that point because she had seen Menzies' resignation in 1939 from the cabinet just before Joe died as being treacherous, but she took a long time to get over it, but she did get over it in time. But she was important to showing the rest of the party that women could be good in politics. I mean, she may never have been a significant minister or anything, but she certainly got media attention and she certainly could take it to the other side in her way.
Yes, and she was obviously an amazing campaigner. And I wondered if we could come back to the AWNL. So it's giving up a lot, as you said, to become part of the Liberal Party. It's basically ensuring that it can't speak independently as it had before on issues that it cares about, that its members now have to be part of a broader movement that includes men and, of course, a movement that really is led almost entirely by men, despite the fact that in Victoria 50% of the organisational positions do go to women. But was it something about the political philosophy that had been developed for this new Liberal Party that attracted the AWNL? Or is it just an evolution? They thought it was time to be part of a broader movement that could push the issues that they cared about, but in a way that would have a political consequence through representation and then, of course, holding government.
The AWNL was always a very loyalist kind of party, loyalty, the Crown and all such. And certainly they supported the non-Labor side of politics in being anti-communist, being for the family, all those kind of things. And it certainly was May Couchman's idea that you couldn't really influence that stuff if you weren't in the actual organisation. And she failed to ever get into politics. You've got to remember too, by the time she was taken seriously or had risen as she had in the AWNL, she was quite old. Nowadays, you'd think someone who was nearly 80 was reasonably old. And she had gone to university way back, I think, just after the turn of the century or whatever. I mean, she had the energy of a younger person, but in those times, she would be seen as someone who should be in retirement. But the women that came after her were quite different kettle of fish. And it took a long time, though, to get the numbers. Women were taken seriously, but I say in politics, yeah, you're taken seriously, but you've got to get the seat. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Some guy's got to give up a seat for you. it's okay on the tram or the bus, but you've really got to move someone aside in this world where the blokes think they have it still.
Once the AWNL joins or becomes part of the Liberal Party, one of the 18 different organisations that forms the Liberal Party, what influence do you think their members had on the direction of the party? Why were they so important?
Well, again, Menzies realised their importance. They didn't bring a lot of money, but they brought a huge working group. They did underpin the electoral success. Now, 1946, the Liberal Party didn't do very well. And that wasn't anything to do with women. That was partly because it was still very divided. And it was only after 1946 that New South Wales got on top of it. It was a very divisive group. There were all these little organisations that called themselves non-Labor, but it was between 46 and 49 that New South Wales Liberal Party really pulled itself together. And there was a bit of that elsewhere as well, because they had been in different sort of groups. Women and the AWNL, they can't be seen as pushing any particular mandate for some particular policy for women. Enid Lyons was very strong on the need for better services for child endowment and whatever. But I think mainly they were there to they pounded the idea of women being important, women being an important part of policy. It was that post-war feeling that we couldn't lose what we had. For a while, the Labor Party were the great winners. But the other thing that they did quite strongly was there was a movement, because you understand the bank nationalisation policy that Chifley wanted to bring in. The women took a big part in that alongside the many that demonstrated. There was a huge demonstration in Canberra and women spoke. They brought lots of people to it. It was public. But Enid Lyons got to the Prime Minister, got a delegation to the Prime Minister. And it was that anti-bank nationalisation almost propelled Menzies into the lodge in 1949. And what the women did was they were there too. They were there with their voices. So it wasn't that they were just after things for women, but they were after a government that was for private enterprise, small business, all of those things, which no doubt their husbands were in, or they might have been in themselves, who knows. But that group of what Menzies came to call the forgotten people, the people who weren't unionised, the people who wanted to make a living for themselves or took the initiative to do so, the AWNL was into that. Big time.
Something I think is perhaps underrated is the organisational know-how that AWNL brings to the new Liberal Party. This sort of idea that there are branch structures, there's regular meetings, there's campaign activities that are coordinated, there's fundraising separate from the politicians, all these organisational things that really have to get done as part of a campaign, as part of a professional political party. Previous iterations, the UAP and the Nationalists, hadn't necessarily had that quite sophisticated level of organisation. And this was something that, I mean, as you were saying before, and these AWNL members were great workers, great volunteers, prepared to go and hand out, prepared to do a lot of the hard work of campaigning.
Yeah, absolutely. And they did all that as AWNL, but when they were inside the party, they were invaluable. What they became, and you're right, what they became was a structure that the Liberal Party could develop. And without that, it would have been very hard for the Liberal Party to develop the structure it did. Now, the difference between Victoria and New South Wales was partly that. Victoria didn't have the problem that New South Wales had between 46 and 49. And that would be because the AWNL was very much Victorian-based. In New South Wales, they lacked that unity, and it took those 3 years to bring it to readiness to act as one. It's been written about. I mean, the New South Wales Liberal Party took a while to be united. By 49 it was. But I see that the Victorian section of the Liberal Party was much quicker to be a united front, and that all goes to the AWNL now. And the interesting thing was, it's very funny, it was women that showed them how to be pragmatic organisers. I mean, it's sad in life. There's so many men that strut the stage, but if you look behind, there's a whole lot of women probably doing all the hack work. Couchman and Enid Lyons were saying is come to the front as well as organise your way there. I mean, even Enid Lyons getting a seat, there would have been enormous organisation that had to go into that on a small scale, but she had the ability to structure what she was doing and get where she did.
So historians never really like these kind of counterfactuals because how would you know? But if the AWNL hadn't decided to join Menzies' Liberal Party, what do you think would have happened to the Liberal Party?
Well, it probably would have succeeded in some way or other, but it wouldn't have been the same. The whole point of the matter was it took Labor a long time to work it out. The Labor split was very blokey, utterly blokey. And you sort of wonder, I mean, this is just off the track, whether it could have never happened or if it hadn't been a lot of boys punching each other. And I know that's trivialising what actually happened. But the answer was so pugilistic, it was a real fight and one side lost. I like to think that there are other ways of doing things, and it may not be the female that's caused that, but when you have a more varied group of people or people with different attitudes to how you might do things, It moderates to some extent the way you're going to do it. It also, I think, made the Liberal Party look fresh and new. And in time, it had captured a wave. It was ahead of, and we all forget, there's so many Labor historians that talk about the Labor Party as if they were the Great Enlightenment. Well, they might have been the Great Enlightenment, but they were more misogynistic and more masculine than the Liberal side of politics for a long time, right through the 50s, 60s, even into the 70s, and then they started to change.
The campaigns that the early Liberal Party ran, and obviously spearheaded by Robert Menzies as the leader and, of course, the Prime Minister, were avowedly focused on the female vote, weren't they?
Yes, exactly.
Can you deduce that there was the influence of people like May Couchman in counselling Menzies to talk about those issues, or Enid Lyons?
I agree. I agree with you on that. And I think even Menzies' ability to factor in the female vote goes back to Lyons. I still think that the Lyons attitude to, I mean, he was laughed at. He gets votes, but he's got nothing else. I mean, that wasn't true of Lyons, but that was the way it was looked at. It's like, you don't have to go after the vote, but you do. He was ahead of his time in that. And in doing that, he moderated those brittle edges of the old nationalists that were seen to be the upper class looking down on the unfortunate lower level. And so the female in all of that can actually make you look much broader, a much broader church. Now, it took time, but the issues became much more focused on things that women would appreciate. The issue of family, the issue of home ownership, the issue of benefits for children, widows. There was a whole heap of stuff there. And the sort of bank nationalisation thing where people didn't want to be taken over by a big monolithical financial group. They wanted their freedom and independence. Even the idea of individual freedom, those sorts of things, not being tacked on to big groups that tell you how to think. I think women had a lot of influence there too. I mean, not that the men didn't know what they were doing. That's sure they did.
But identifying that the female vote was something worthy of specific attention, had a campaign to women specifically, to respect women enough to the point where, you know, they're the one as an individual making the choice who they're going to vote for, not being told to vote a certain way by their spouse, parent.
It's all true. I mean, even John Howard says in the referendum in 51, it was the first time his parents voted differently, but they did vote differently. And that was the point. And education too. The fact that women could take part in higher education, no differently from men, that became a big thing too, big change. But the idea of attracting the female vote was seriously important. And after the men came home from the war and we sailed along with Chifley and Curtin, I mean, there came a point where it was clear that the economy needed to be loosened up, freed up, and a lot of women felt forgotten, that they were just part of the general system. But we all know, the more you diversify and throw more interest into the pool, the more you're going to be looking around at what needs to be done for people who feel they've been left out. I mean, look at those riots in Britain right now. I mean, some say sort of like the Black Lives Matter moment in America, that there's a group of people who just scream, we're not being listened to. And they do it in the most wildly impractical way, but somewhere along the line, they've been forgotten. And got to find out why they've been forgotten and so what. Now, in our world today, it's said Donald Trump's very good at talking about the swap, but there's some notion that the very educated people are sort of looking down on the plebs. And The Voice last year, the vote, those that lost turned on people who weren't so well educated, as if not being so well educated meant you really can't think what should happen to benefit of a group of people. Anyway, the 44 Liberal Party with the AWNL in it broadened their base and meant that they had to talk to a much broader group, not forgetting that the AWNL brought precious organisational skills into what was a very new group. But the other thing you've got to remember is that in 31, when Lyons had his great victory, I've had some disputes with Michael Kroger on this, it was a phenomenal victory, but because some of the groups were called different names, and they all came together for the one cause, it's seen as not quite the victory. But it was so divided. There were little leagues here and little leagues there, loyalists there. And when 44 happened, it was starting to break up into those little interest groups as well, again. And so the organisation of putting that party together as one voice. And look at Queensland, they still can't quite work out Liberal National in Queensland. It's a big step to bring a lot of different individual voices together. And by 49, they had done that.
Yes, an amazing act of political mastery to bring all those, as you say, all those different groups, the 18 different groups, into one political movement, one political party with a unifying philosophy, but an element of autonomy between the states, of course, and,
that's true,
and the different branches as well. Anne Henderson, thank you so much for joining me today on Afternoon Light to talk about how women made a difference to the founding of the Liberal Party in 1944.
Thanks, Georgina.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.